Hand over the keys, Eleanor. This is our father's house now. The words sliced through the quiet of the living room. My stepson, Mark, stood before me, his hand outstretched. His sister, Susan, stood just behind his shoulder, nodding like a little doll. The last of the funeral guests had just left. The air was thick with the scent of leftover ham sandwiches and wilting lilies. My husband, Robert, had been in the ground for less than 4 hours. A cold dread, colder than the November air outside, washed over my grief. I stared at his open palm. He wanted the keys to my home, the home I'd kept for 30 years, the place where I'd planted the rose bushes and patched the drywall and knew the exact floorboard that creaked by the stairs. My entire life, my security, was tied to that little brass ring, and they were trying to take it. I just stared at that key ring in Mark's demanding hand, the gold one for the front door, the silver for the back, the tiny one for the garden shed. My life in metal. He had the same look in his eyes he'd had 20 years ago at a big Christmas dinner. He'd had too much wine that night. We were all gathered around the big oak table, the one Robert and I had bought at an antique fair. Mark raised his glass for a toast. "To Dad," he'd said, looking right at me, "and to his most expensive hobby." The whole table went silent. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks. Susan giggled into her napkin. Under the heavy linen tablecloth, Robert just squeezed my hand. He never said a word to his son. Not then. Not ever. He just squeezed my hand, a silent apology that changed nothing. "I need a moment," I said. My voice was a whisper, but it was steady. Mark sneered. "Fine. A few minutes?" He and Susan walked into the kitchen, their footsteps heavy on the linoleum. I heard the refrigerator door open and the clink of a bottle. They were making themselves at home. My home. I stood up from the scratchy sofa. Alone in the living room, I walked over to the thermostat on the wall. The little digital display read 71 degrees. With one trembling finger, I pushed the up arrow. 72. The furnace kicked on with a soft, familiar rumble. It was a small, foolish thing to do. An act of ownership only I would know. But the house felt different now. It felt vast and silent. No longer a place we shared. It was just a building, and I was a trespasser inside it. The next morning, the phone on my nightstand shrilled. It was Susan. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind she used when she wanted something. "Eleanor, I was just thinking of you," she cooed. "I know this is all so overwhelming." I said nothing. I just listened to the hum of the air conditioning. "Mark and I thought we could make some suggestions," she went on, "to help you sort through Daddy's things, make it easier for you." She paused, then added, "In fact, I found an appraiser who is available next Tuesday. He can value the furniture for the estate sale." My grip tightened on the phone. An estate sale. In my house. "We'll need you out by the end of the month, of course," she said, her voice bright and helpful. "We want to list it quickly." I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. My hand was trembling so badly I had to set the receiver down twice before it landed in its cradle. I sat on the edge of my bed, the old quilt my grandmother made feeling thin and useless. I got up, went to my little desk in the corner, and turned on the computer. The screen felt too bright. I went to my bank's website. My personal savings account, the one I'd fed with my teacher's pension for 40 years, held a respectable amount. But it wasn't enough to buy a new house. Not in this market. Not at my age. I clicked over to the Social Security site. The widow's benefit from Robert hadn't been processed yet. It would take weeks, maybe months. A wave of pure, cold panic washed over me. This wasn't just greed. They were trying to make me homeless. The numbers on the screen were stark and unforgiving, and they all said the same thing. I was in terrible trouble. My best friend from church, Carol, came over that evening. She didn't knock, just let herself in with a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel. The smell of warm tuna and melted cheese filled my kitchen. She put it on the counter and wrapped her arms around me. "I brought your favourite," she said, her voice soft. We sat at the little kitchen table, the one where Robert and I drank our morning coffee for 30 years. I told her everything, about the keys, the appraiser, the phone call. She listened, her brow furrowed. The fork in her hand was still. "That boy always did have a mean streak," she finally said, pushing a noodle around her plate. "But Eleanor, you are not a weak woman. You never have been." She looked right at me, her eyes clear and fierce. "What did Robert arrange for you? He loved you. He must have done something." Her words planted a tiny seed of fight in the barren soil of my grief. What had Robert arranged? The next day, Mark showed up unannounced. I was outside in the morning sun, watering my petunias. The water made dark circles on the dry concrete patio. I heard the side gate creak open, and there he was, holding a yellow tape measure. He didn't say hello. "Just getting the dimensions for the real estate listing," he said, not even looking at me. He walked right into the living room, the screen door slamming behind him. I heard the metallic zip of the tape measure, then the clatter as he let it retract. Zip, clatter, zip, clatter. I stood there on my own patio, holding the green watering can, smelling the damp earth. The sun was warm on my arms. I felt like a ghost in my own home. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioner kicking on and off. I wandered through the dark rooms, my hand trailing along the walls. My mind flashed back to a rainy Saturday, maybe 10 years ago. Robert was in the attic, cleaning out old boxes. He'd come down with a heavy old tin lockbox, the kind people used to keep important papers in. He held it with both hands. "For your peace of mind, Ellie," he'd said, his voice serious. He patted the top of it. "My guarantee." He put it on the high shelf in the back of our bedroom closet. I went to the closet and pulled a chair over. My heart was pounding. There it was, tucked behind a stack of blankets. It was dusty and heavier than I remembered. I brought it down to the bed, my hands trembling. But the little brass key was not with it. I spent the next hour searching. I went through my desk, the little dish in the kitchen where we kept loose change, then Robert's study. I opened every drawer, my fingers sifting through paper clips and old pens. No key. A cold doubt started to creep into my bones. Did I imagine it? Was it just another one of Robert's gestures? He was a good man, but he hated conflict. Maybe putting the box away was just his way of making me feel better, with nothing real inside. I remembered the day I'd insisted on the prenup, before we were married. He was so hurt. "Don't you trust me, Ellie?" he'd asked, his voice low. "It's not about not trusting you, Robert," I told him, my hands folded in my lap. "It's about making sure your children can never question my place here." He had sighed, but he had agreed. Was this box the result of that promise, or just an empty comfort? Defeated, I sat on the edge of my bed. I started sorting through a small jewelry box Robert had given me for our 5th anniversary. It was full of costume brooches and pins I never wore. I ran my fingers through the tangle of fake pearls and cheap metal. Tucked deep into the red velvet lining, I felt something small and cold. It wasn't a pin. I pulled it out. It was a simple, old-fashioned skeleton key, the kind that fits an old tin box. I held it in my palm. It felt heavy, solid. It felt like the key to my entire future. With hands that trembled just a little, I climbed the rickety pull-down stairs to the attic. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten things. I found the tin box, tucked behind a stack of Robert's college yearbooks. The little skeleton key slid into the lock with a rusty scrape. It turned with a satisfying click. Inside, resting on a bed of old tax returns, was the manila envelope. It was heavy in my hands, the paper yellowed and soft at the edges. In crisp black typewriter font, it read, Robert Miller and Eleanor Vance. My maiden name. I pulled out the thick document, held together by a single, sturdy staple in the corner. Across the top of the first page were 2 words, prenuptial agreement. I didn't bother going back downstairs. I sat right there on the dusty floorboards, a single beam of light from the small attic window cutting through the gloom. The legal language was a forest of heretofores and whereas clauses, dense and confusing. But I pushed through, my finger tracing each line until I found the part that mattered. Clause 4b. It was written in plain enough English. In the event of Robert's death, sole title to the marital home located at 124 Willow Lane, including all contents therein, shall transfer unencumbered to Eleanor Vance Miller. A jolt went through me. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was the cold, clean feeling of pure, unadulterated power. I had saved myself 30 years ago. I carefully placed the document back in the envelope and went down to my little office nook off the kitchen. The law firm's name was printed on the envelope. Davies and Son, attorneys at law. My heart hammered against my ribs. A quick search on the computer showed they were still in business, right downtown. The founding partner, a kind old man named Mr. Davies Sr., had passed away years ago. His son, James Davies, now ran the firm. I stared at his picture on the website. He had a nice face, with kind eyes like his father's. I looked from his photo back to the envelope in my hand. I thought to myself, a woman's peace of mind is not a gift from a man. It is a contract she makes with her future self. This was my next step. My hand was shaking when I dialed the number. My voice came out as a squeak. I'd like to speak with Mr. James Davies, please. Is he expecting your call? The receptionist asked. Her voice was brisk and businesslike. No, I said quietly. It's about a sensitive estate matter. He's very busy today. What is this in reference to? She asked, a clear note of dismissal in her tone. I almost hung up right then, feeling foolish and small. I took a deep breath, the smell of old coffee from this morning's pot still lingering in the air. It's about a prenuptial agreement, I said, my voice suddenly firm. For Robert Miller? There was a short pause on the other end of the line. The clicking of a keyboard stopped. One moment, please, she said, her tone completely changed. A moment later, a warm, masculine voice came on the line. Mrs. Miller, this is James Davies. My father spoke of you. He said you were one of the smartest clients he ever had. He paused. How can I help you? The relief that washed over me was so intense, my knees felt weak. I had to sit down right there at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a sharp, angry sound in the quiet house. I picked it up. It was a text message from Mark. My hands were still damp from washing the breakfast dishes. The message read, We're holding an estate sale in 2 weeks. Go through the house and put sticky notes on the few things you intend to keep. The sheer audacity of it stole my breath. I had to lean against the counter, the cold laminate pressing into my back. A few things. As if 30 years of my life could be reduced to a few sticky notes on a lamp and a photo album. I picked up the phone again and called Mr. Davies. My voice shook as I read him the text. He was silent for a moment. The only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator. "Do not reply with anger, Eleanor," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Simply write this back to him." He dictated the words slowly. I wrote them on the little notepad I keep by the phone. "Thank you for the notice. I am reviewing my legal documents and will be in touch." I typed the message, my thumb hovering over the send button. They thought I was a piece of furniture in my husband's house. They were about to learn I was the foundation. I pressed send. Following my lawyer's instructions, I spent the afternoon in Robert's study. The room smelled of old paper and his faint, familiar aftershave. I pulled out the heavy metal box of our important files. I gathered the deed to the house. Our marriage certificate, its edges yellowed with time. Robert's death certificate, a crisp and terrible piece of paper. Deep in a folder, I found old property tax bills from before Robert and I had merged our finances. Cancelled checks with my signature, written from my own teacher's salary. Each document felt like a stone being added to my side of a scale, making it heavier and more solid. The next morning, my neighbour Maria called. "Eleanor, dear," she said, her voice tight with worry. "I don't want to alarm you, but you should look out your front window." I walked into the living room and pulled back the lace curtain. A large, garish red and white "For sale by owner" sign had been hammered into my front lawn, right next to my prize-winning azaleas. My phone rang again, almost immediately. It was Harold from the Homeowners Association. "Eleanor," he said, his voice full of official disapproval. "You know unauthorized signs are against the bylaws. This is a formal warning." My fear from the day before was gone. In its place was an anger so cold and clear it felt like ice in my veins. I didn't even bother to change out of my old gardening clogs. I walked right out the front door, across the damp grass. I grabbed the metal sign with both hands and pulled. It made a satisfying, wrenching sound as it came out of the ground, taking a clump of my good sod with it. I dragged it to the side of the house, behind the big recycling bin, where no one could see it from the street. As I wiped the dirt from my hands, I saw Maria watching from her window. She gave me a slow, deliberate thumbs up. We were a silent army of two. I had a video call with Mr. Davies that afternoon. His face on my little computer screen was calm and reassuring. The fan on my laptop hummed quietly. "It's ironclad, Eleanor," he said, his voice clear through the tiny speakers. "Your foresight 30 years ago was remarkable. Your husband's attorney and my father made sure every I was dotted. We didn't talk about a messy court battle. We talked about a single, quiet meeting, a definitive meeting. My job is to handle the legal details," he told me. "Your only job is to get them in the room." A quiet power began to settle in my bones, pushing out the fear. It was time to stop being a ghost in my own home. After the call, I sat at my little desk in the kitchen nook. The afternoon sun streamed in, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. I opened my email and began to type. My fingers felt slow and clumsy on the keyboard. I wrote a formal message to Mark and Susan. "I would like to invite you both to the house this Friday at 10 a.m., it said. "We will discuss the details of your father's estate. My legal counsel will be present." I read it over 10 times. It sounded so official, so unlike me. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a deep breath, smelling the faint scent of the lemon dish soap in the sink, and I clicked the send button. The trap was set. Friday morning, the air in the house was thick with tension. At 5 minutes to 10, the front door opened without a knock. Mark and Susan walked right in. They were dressed in sharp, dark clothes, like they were on their way to close a business deal. The smell of Mark's strong cologne filled the entryway. They saw me standing by the living room window, and their faces tightened into smug smiles. They thought this was their victory lap. "Good. You've got your lawyer coming," Mark said, waving a dismissive hand. "Saves us the trouble of having to formally evict you." He didn't even seem to notice the tremor in my hands. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell chimed. The sound cut through the heavy silence. I walked over and opened it to find Mr. Davies. He was a kind-looking man, just like his photo, and he held a handsome leather briefcase. The morning air felt cool and fresh for a moment before I closed the door. "Mark, Susan, this is Mr. James Davies," I said. Mark scoffed. He didn't even stand up. "Look, pal," he said, pointing a finger at Mr. Davies. "We don't need to drag this out. She gets her widow's pension and whatever's in her name. The house is ours." His words hung in the air, just as ugly as they were the day of the funeral. We all sat in the living room. The leather on Robert's big armchair sighed as I sat down. Mr. Davies placed his briefcase on the coffee table and clicked the latches open. The sound was crisp and final. He didn't look at Mark or Susan. He looked directly at me, his eyes gentle. "Eleanor," he asked, "shall we begin?" I just nodded, unable to speak. He cleared his throat and pulled out a thick, yellowed document. "As per the legally binding prenuptial agreement signed by Robert Miller and Eleanor Vance on June 5th, 1993. The smiles vanished from Mark's and Susan's faces. "What agreement?" Mark sputtered. The colour drained from his face, leaving it a pasty grey. "Dad never mentioned an agreement." Mr. Davies didn't even look at him. He continued reading in a calm, steady voice that filled the quiet room. "All assets held within the marital home, including the property itself, its contents, and all associated accounts, transfer directly to Eleanor Vance Miller upon my death." The sound of Mark's chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor made me jump. He shot to his feet, his hands balled into fists. "That's a lie. That's not valid." Susan started to cry. It wasn't the soft, grieving sound I'd heard at the funeral. This was a hard, ugly noise, full of frustrated rage. Her face was red and blotchy. "Daddy would never, ever do that to his own children," she wailed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She tricked him." She turned her whole body toward me, her eyes narrowed into slits. The air crackled with her hatred. "You gold-digging witch." Mr. Davies calmly slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface of the coffee table. It stopped right in front of Mark. "This is a copy of the signature page," he said, his voice even. Robert's familiar, bold signature was right there in dark blue ink. Next to it was my own, a little shakier, but clear. Below them were the signatures of 2 witnesses and the embossed, faded seal of a notary public. "Your father was of sound mind and had his own legal counsel present," Mr. Davies said quietly. "It's all perfectly legal." Mark stared at the paper, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then, with a roar, he lunged across the table, his hand reaching to snatch the document and rip it to shreds. Mr. Davies was surprisingly quick for a man his age. He pulled the paper back, just as Mark's fingers grazed it. The air conditioner clicked on, filling the sudden, tense silence with a low hum. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a steely calm. "This is merely a copy. The original is filed with the court, and another is in a bank vault." He looked Mark dead in the eye, and for the first time, Mark flinched. "This is not a negotiation." I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it seemed to cut right through the tension in the room. They both turned to look at me, surprised I could even make a sound. "Your father was a good man," I said, looking from Mark's furious face to Susan's tear-streaked one. "But he was a conflict-avoidant one. I knew this day would come." I took a slow breath and let it out. "I insisted on this agreement 30 years ago. It was my one condition for marrying him, to protect my future from your greed." There was a stunned silence. They had no response. Mr. Davies stood up, his movements crisp and final. "This meeting is over," he said. "I suggest you see yourselves out. Any further communication must go through my office." Defeated, they shuffled out the door. Susan was sobbing, a raw, ugly sound that filled the hallway. Mark looked like he wanted to punch the wall, his hands balled into tight fists. I just sat there, watching them go, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness where the fear used to be. The front door clicked shut, and the silence they left behind was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, the smell filling the quiet house. I took my favorite mug out to the front porch and sat in the old wicker chair. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the night-blooming jasmine from next door. I watched the sky turn from a deep grey to a soft, hopeful pink. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't afraid of who might show up at my door. This quiet moment, with the warm mug in my hands and the birds just starting to sing, belonged only to me. For the first time in 30 years, I wondered what I might do with a day that was entirely my own. My phone buzzed on the little table beside me. It was an unknown number. I watched it ring, then stop. A moment later, a voicemail notification popped up. I pressed play and held the phone away from my ear. It was Susan's husband, a blustering, angry man I'd never liked. His voice was a recording of pure rage, yelling about lawyers and contesting the prenup and what a terrible person I was. "We'll see you in court, Eleanor," he shouted. "You won't get away with this." I listened for about 10 seconds. Then I pressed the delete button. A small smile played on my lips as the angry red notification vanished from my screen. It was time to make a phone call of my own. A nice young man in a blue work shirt arrived an hour later. "You called for a locksmith, ma'am?" he asked politely. "Yes, I did," I said, opening the door wider. "I'd like every single lock on the house changed, please. The front door, the back door, the side door, and the little gate to the backyard." He got to work immediately. I sat in the living room, listening to the sounds of him drilling and fitting. It was the sound of the past being removed. When he was finished, he handed me a small ring with 3 new, shiny keys on it. They felt heavy and solid in my hand. They felt like safety. That afternoon, my best friend Carol came over. She wasn't carrying one of her sympathy tuna casseroles. She was holding a bottle of chilled Prosecco and 2 clean glasses. "I heard through the church grapevine," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Thought this was more appropriate." We sat at my kitchen table, the sun streaming through the window. She popped the cork with a satisfying thump, and the bubbles fizzed in our glasses. She made me tell her the whole story, from Mark's cruel words to the look on his face when Mr. Davies read the prenup. We raised our glasses. "To foresight," Carol said. I laughed so hard, a few tears of pure relief rolled down my cheeks. Carol came over that evening. She wasn't carrying a Pyrex dish covered in foil. She was holding a bottle of chilled Prosecco. "This is not a tuna casserole situation," she announced, setting the bottle on my kitchen counter with a satisfying thud. "This is a victory situation." I found 2 of my good crystal glasses, the ones I never used. Carol popped the cork, and it flew across the room, hitting a cabinet with a harmless little pop. We both jumped, then laughed. She poured the bubbling wine, and the tiny fizzing sound filled the quiet kitchen. She raised her glass. "To foresight," she said, her eyes twinkling. "To foresight," I echoed, and our glasses clinked. The wine was cold and sweet. I took a sip and felt a laugh bubble up from deep inside me. It started small, then grew until tears were streaming down my face, mixing with the laughter. It was the sound of 30 years of quiet worry finally leaving my body. A few days later, the mail carrier knocked on my door. He held out a stiff, green and white envelope and a small electronic device. "Certified letter for you, Eleanor." My heart did a little flip-flop. I signed my name with a shaky finger. The envelope felt heavy and official in my hands. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, some fancy-sounding name from the city. I knew exactly what it was. The first shot in their new war. I walked into the study, laid the letter face down on the desk, and took a deep breath. My first instinct was to rip it open, to let the fear and anger wash over me. But then I remembered Mr. Davies's calm voice. I took out my phone, scanned the unopened envelope, and attached it to an email. I sent it to him with a simple subject line. "And so it begins." Mr. Davies called me 2 hours later. His voice was as steady as a rock. "Eleanor, I have the letter. They're officially contesting the prenup." I sank into my desk chair, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. "On what grounds?" I asked, my own voice a thin whisper. "The usual," he said, and I could almost hear him shrugging. "They're claiming undue influence. They are going to argue that you somehow manipulated your husband into signing it 30 years ago." He paused for a moment. "It's a scare tactic." My heart was pounding in my ears like a drum. "A scare tactic? It feels very real to me, James." "I know it does," he said gently. "This is standard procedure for greedy children, Eleanor. It's designed to make you panic and settle. It would cost them a fortune to pursue, and they have no evidence. We will call their bluff." He said the next words slowly and clearly. "Do nothing. Live your life." After I hung up the phone, I sat in the silence for a long time. Live your life. It sounded so simple. I stood up and walked to Robert's closet. I hadn't been able to open it since he passed. I pulled the wooden door, and the familiar scent of his cologne and cedar blocks washed over me. Instead of the wave of grief I expected, I felt a sense of purpose. I took out his beautiful wool suits, his starched shirts, his silk ties. I folded them carefully, one by one, and placed them in large boxes. The work was slow and methodical. The next day, I drove the boxes to a charity downtown, one that helps veterans get dressed for job interviews. As I watched the volunteer carry the last box inside, I thought to myself, I am turning my past into someone else's future. The following afternoon, my phone rang with a number from another state. I almost didn't answer, but something made me press the green button. "Hello?" "Eleanor, it's Sarah, Robert's niece." Her voice was kind and hesitant. We hadn't spoken in years. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I heard what Mark and Susan tried to do." There was a pause. "I'm so sorry. For what it's worth, my side of the family is entirely on your side." I had to sit down on the porch steps. The warmth of the sun on my back felt just like the warmth spreading through my chest. To know I wasn't entirely alone in his family, that someone else saw the truth, felt like a warm blanket being wrapped around my shoulders. I saw the HOA president, Bill, at the community mailbox. The metal door of my little box clanged shut as he walked over, a worried look on his face. Eleanor, he started, about that sign. I gave him a small, tight smile. The afternoon sun felt warm on my back. It's been handled, Bill. I shifted the weight of the mail in my hand, a grocery store flyer and a bill from the electric company. And just to clear up any confusion, I said, my voice calm and even, I am the sole owner of 124 Willow Lane. The sign has been disposed of. Have a lovely day. He was so surprised he just blinked at me. For a moment, his mouth opened and closed like a fish. Oh, he finally managed. Well, good day then. As I walked away, I felt a surge of power, as clean and sharp as the edge of a new piece of paper. I spent the whole next afternoon in the garden, pulling weeds with a vengeance. My back ached and my knees complained, but the feeling of roots tearing from the damp earth was deeply satisfying. I decided then and there to rip out the fussy boxwood shrubs Robert had loved so much. They were always needing to be trimmed just so. I drove to the garden centre, the smell of fertilizer and potting soil filling my car. I bought 3 climbing rose bushes, their tags showing pictures of deep red and pale pink blossoms. These climbers are tough, the young man who helped me load them said. They'll need a good trellis. I'll build one, I told him, surprising myself. They need something strong to hold on to. Back home, digging in the dirt, I felt like I was planting new roots for myself. Maria, my neighbor, waved me over to the fence later that week. The cicadas were buzzing their loud, lazy song in the afternoon heat. Eleanor, she said in a conspiratorial whisper, you didn't hear it from me, but I saw a U-Haul over at Mark's rental place yesterday. Oh, I said, trying to sound casual as I leaned against the cool chain link. Looked like he was downsizing, she said, with a little sniff of satisfaction. A much smaller truck than the one he moved in with. We shared a look that said more than words ever could. That evening, as I was washing my dinner dishes, my phone let out a sharp, electronic chime. I dried my hands and looked at the screen. It was a notification from my Ring doorbell. On the porch stood Susan, her face puffy and stained with tears. I stared at her image on the video screen, a grainy picture of misery under my porch light. I didn't feel the stab of pity I expected. I just felt a quiet, heavy finality, like the last page of a long book being turned. She raised a trembling hand to knock again. Before she could, I pressed the button to speak. Susan. I heard my own voice come through the small speaker, clear and steady, without a trace of a wobble. We have nothing to discuss. You are not welcome here. I watched on the screen as her face crumpled. Her shoulders shook. She stood there for another moment, then turned and walked down the path, disappearing into the darkness. I pressed the button to end the recording. The silence in my hallway felt vast and complete. The next week, I had an appointment with a financial planner, a nice woman named Ms. Albright. Her office smelled of fresh coffee and clean paper. We sat at a big, polished wood table. So this living trust ensures your assets avoid probate, she explained in a calm, reassuring voice. Everything goes directly to your beneficiaries, your daughter, your grandchildren. Exactly, I said, looking at the neat stack of documents. I want to make sure everything is clear, no confusion for anyone. She smiled. This is very well thought out, Eleanor. You're building a wonderful legacy. As I signed the last page, the pen feeling solid in my hand, I thought to myself, my money will go toward building things, not breaking them. When I left the office, clutching the folder that held my secure future, my phone buzzed with an alert from my bank. A large deposit had just been made. I checked my bank account online. the way I did every Thursday morning. But this time was different. A new deposit was there, larger than any I had ever seen. It was my first combined payment, my Social Security, plus the spousal survivor benefit from Robert's pension. I stared at the number on the screen. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than enough. It was security. It was peace. It was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the gas bill paid on time. I did what I always did. I transferred a small amount into my savings account. The habit was comforting, a little bit of the old me stepping into this new life. It felt like clicking a lock into place. A week later, I decided to host a small dinner party. It felt strange to plan something so joyful in the house that had seen so much grief, but it also felt right. I called Carol and Maria, and then, on an impulse, I called Robert's niece, Sarah. "I know it's a long drive," I told her. "I'll be there, Eleanor," she said, her voice warm. I wouldn't miss it. That night, we sat around my dining room table, using the good china that hadn't seen the light of day in years. We ate lasagna and drank a little red wine. The room was filled with laughter, not the tense silence I had grown used to. This was my family now, the one I chose. I received a letter in a crisp, white envelope from Mr. Davies's office. I didn't feel the usual spike of fear when I saw the law firm's name. I opened it with a steady hand. The letter was short. Mark and Susan had officially withdrawn their legal challenge. The last line gave the reason. Due to prohibitive costs and lack of evidence. So their greed was their undoing, I said out loud to the empty room. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. It was over. The war was finished, and I hadn't fired a single shot. I had simply stood my ground on the truth I had built 30 years ago. I found an old photo album under the coffee table. I sat on the sofa and slowly turned the thick, plastic-covered pages. There were pictures of Robert and me, from our wedding day, from vacations to the coast, from simple afternoons in the garden. I missed my husband. I missed his quiet presence in the evenings and the way he always made the coffee too strong. But as I looked at our smiling faces, I realized something else. I did not miss the constant, low-level anxiety of managing his children's expectations. I felt both grief and relief, and I decided that was okay. The next day, I was driving home from the grocery store and passed the little travel agency in town. A bright poster in the window showed a massive ship sailing past giant blue walls of ice. Alaska. I had always wanted to see the glaciers. On a whim, I pulled over, parked the car, and walked inside. The bell over the door chimed. "Can I help you?" a young woman asked from behind a desk. "Yes," I said, my voice clearer than I expected. "I'd like to book a trip." An hour later, I walked out with a ticket for one, my name printed neatly on the confirmation. While I was packing for the cruise, I found a framed photo tucked away in the back of my closet. It was from our wedding day. Robert looked so handsome, and I looked so young, with a worried little line between my eyebrows that the photographer didn't catch. I remembered my secret worry that day, the one I never told a soul. It was the fear that his children would one day try to erase me. I ran my finger over the cool glass, tracing Robert's smiling face. "I did it, Robert," I whispered to the quiet room. "I'm okay." I wrapped the photo in a soft sweater and placed it right in the center of my suitcase. The day before I left, I walked over to Maria's house. The air was warm and smelled of cut grass. I held out the single, shiny brass key. "I was wondering if you could keep an eye on things," I said, "and maybe water the new roses for me." She took the key, her warm, dry hand closing over mine for a moment. "Of course, Eleanor," she said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You go have the time of your life. You've earned it. As I walked back to my own front door, I didn't feel the old familiar knot of anxiety about leaving my house in someone else's care. I just felt trust. From the deck of the ship, I watched the massive, ancient blue ice of a glacier. The air was so cold, it felt clean in my lungs. A woman standing next to me, wrapped in a bright red scarf, murmured, "Isn't it breathtaking?" I just nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "It certainly is," I finally managed. The glacier moved too slowly to see, but I could hear it groaning and cracking, a deep sound that vibrated through the ship's railing under my hands. It was a quiet, immense power that had carved mountains over thousands of years. I felt a strange kinship with it. Slow, steady, and in the end, completely unstoppable. In the ship's little gift shop, I bought a postcard of the mountains we had passed that morning. I found a quiet corner in the lounge, ordered a cup of tea, and sat down to write. The card was glossy and cool to the touch. I wrote a short note and addressed it to Carol. "The world is so big and beautiful," I wrote. "Feeling peaceful, feeling free. Love, Eleanor." I read the words back to myself. It was the truest thing I had written in 30 years. I put a stamp on it, feeling like I was mailing a little piece of my newfound peace back home. When the taxi pulled up to my house, I felt a wave of simple happiness. It looked so solid and welcoming. My new roses, watered by Maria, were covered in tiny, perfect buds. That evening, I made a cup of peppermint tea and sat in my garden as the sun set. I could hear the distant laughter of neighbours and the soft hum of a peaceful life. My phone buzzed on the little table. It was Carol. "You're home," she said. "Was it wonderful?" I looked at the pink and orange clouds, the warm light on my little green leaves. "It was," I said, a smile in my voice. "But this is better." I took a sip of my tea. I was finally and completely home.